What you have been told about Salat your entire life is not just wrong. It is internally, logically, textually, and linguistically impossible to defend from the Quran itself. And I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. I'm going to use nothing but the Quran, the Arabic language, and basic logic to show you that the word Salat simply cannot mean a physical, repetitive, 5 times daily ritual prayer. And by the end of this video, you will not be able to unsee what you are about to see. Let's start with the single most devastating verse in the entire Quran for the traditional interpretation. Chapter 33, verse 56. Allah says, Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi. God and his angels do salat upon the Prophet. Now stop right there. If salat means ritual prayer, the bowing, the prostrating, the specific postures, the recitations, then what this verse is telling you is that God Almighty gets down on a prayer mat and performs ritual prayer directed at the Prophet Muhammad. The angels line up behind him and do the same. Does that make any sense to you whatsoever? Of course it doesn't. It is theologically incoherent. It is logically absurd. And every single traditional scholar and translator in history knows this, which is why, and pay very close attention here, they translate that exact same word, yusallun, as blessings when God is the subject, and as ritual prayer when humans are the subject. The same Arabic word, the same grammatical form, 2 completely different translations depending on who is doing it. That is not translation, that is manipulation. So right there, the traditional case has already collapsed. But we are only getting started. Go to chapter 22, verse 40. The verse lists places, Sawami'u wa biyarun wa salawatun wa masajid, monasteries, churches, salawat, mosques. Traditional translations render salawatun here as synagogues. The plural of the same root as salah is being used to describe a physical place of Jewish worship. Because the root of this word is not about a specific Islamic ritual invented in the 7th century, it is about orientation, devotion, turning toward. The word exists in Syriac as salota, meaning connection or attachment to the divine. The concept predates Islam. It describes a direction of the soul, not a choreographed sequence of the body. And now we arrive at what is perhaps the most elegant and airtight piece of evidence in this entire discussion, and it comes from inside the Quran itself, with 0 external sources required. Chapter 75, Al-Qiyamah, verses 31 and 32. فَلَا صَدَّقَ وَلَا صَلَّى وَلَكِنْ كَذَّبَ وَتَوَلَّى. So he neither believed nor salah, but instead he denied and tawalla, turned away. Look at the structure of that sentence. The Quran is operating in perfect parallel. 2 pairs. Believed is set against denied. Salah is set against tawalla. In Arabic literary structure, and the Quran is the highest standard of Arabic literary structure that exists, when you construct a chiasm like this, the opposing terms define each other. Tawalla means to turn away. Every scholar on earth agrees to that. It comes from the root waw lam ya, meaning to turn one's back, to withdraw, to face away. So what is the direct opposite of turning away? Turning toward. And that is exactly what salah means in this verse. Turned toward, oriented toward, faced toward God. The Quran is literally defining its own vocabulary through contrast. You do not need a hadith for this. You do not need a scholar. You need to read the sentence. The Quran is its own dictionary if you let it speak. You cannot substitute the traditional meaning into that verse and have it make any sense. He neither believed nor performed his 5 daily prayers, but instead denied and turned away. That is not a parallel. That is a grammatical catastrophe. The verse only works, only flows, only carries its devastating poetic logic if salah means turned toward. Believed and turned toward are the 2 virtues. Denied and turned away are their paired opposites. The Quran has told you exactly what this word means. It told you itself. Now let's talk about the verb the Quran uses when it commands salat, because this is something almost nobody discusses, and it is absolutely critical. The Quran does not say addu as-salah. It does not use any verb that means perform, carry out, do, or execute. It says Aqimu as-salah over and over again. Aqimu, from the root kaf waw mim, to establish, to erect, to institute, to cause to stand as a system. This is the same route the Quran uses when it commands establishing justice, Aqimu al-Qista. The same route used for establishing testimony, for erecting institutions, for making something stand as a permanent functioning reality in the world. You establish a court, you establish a legal order, you establish a civilization. You do not establish a yoga routine. You do not say Aqimu to describe something you perform and then it's over. The verb the Quran chose consistently and deliberately is the verb of institution, of civilization building, of structural creation. The Quran's own grammar is telling you what Salat is. And think about what this means practically. The traditional salah of bowing and prostrating has been established for 1200 years. It is practiced in every Muslim country, every mosque, every Muslim household across the planet. If Aqimu al-Salat means establish this physical ritual, then the command was fulfilled centuries ago, and the ongoing command to establish it makes no sense. It's already established everywhere. But if Aqimu al-Salat means establish God's law, His system as a living reality in society, then that command is urgently unfinished, urgently relevant, urgently needed right now. The Quran speaks to every generation. A command to establish something that already exists everywhere is not a command. The Quran does not waste words. Now let's look at Aqimu al-Salat wa atu az-Zakah, because understanding Zakat properly here demolishes another pillar of the traditional framework. The word zakah comes from the root za kaf waw, meaning to purify, to cause to grow in purity, to cleanse. Zakat is not a tax, it is purification. It is the cleansing of wealth, of the soul, of the social fabric of economic life. And this is why Salat and Zakat are always paired. Aqimu as-Salat wa atu az-Zakah. Establish Salat and give Zakat. This pairing appears again and again throughout the Quran as a unit. And no traditional explanation has ever satisfactorily answered why. Why is an alleged 5 times daily universal obligation on every Muslim from puberty paired constantly with an alleged once-a-year financial obligation that only applies to people above a specific wealth threshold? If they were of different natures, one universal and daily, the other conditional and annual, why does the Quran present them as 2 parts of one thing? And here is an analogy that makes the absurdity impossible to ignore. Imagine a king who has written a comprehensive constitution. Laws of justice, fair dealing, protection of the vulnerable. And this king demands that every subject, 5 times a day, stop everything and recite his constitution back to him. What kind of king is that? Wise and just, or vain and needy? And before anyone says it is so, people remember the laws and follow them. The reality is that the vast majority of subjects do not even understand the language it is written in. They have memorized fragments phonetically, sounds without meaning. So they stand 5 times a day reciting sounds they do not understand, while the kingdom remains unjust and the vulnerable remain unprotected. That recitation serves no one, not the king, not the kingdom, not the subjects. God did not send the most ethically sophisticated book in human history so that people could memorize its sounds without comprehending its meaning and perform those sounds facing Mecca 5 times a day. He sent it so that its system could be established and its justice could be lived. Now here is where the Quran does something extraordinary that the traditional framework cannot explain. Chapter 29, verse 45. Inna as-salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. Indeed, Salat prevents fahsha and munkar, indecency and wrongdoing. That is the Quran's own definition of what Salat produces. That is the success metric the Quran itself provides. Now apply that metric honestly, not cynically, but with intellectual seriousness, to the world as it exists. We have over 1 billion Muslims performing the 5 daily prayers. We have societies where the adhan echoes 5 times a day across cities, where mosques are full, where people interrupt work and travel for the ritual. And simultaneously, we have Muslim-majority countries ranking at the top of global corruption indices, with some of the highest rates of fraud, domestic violence, and oppression on earth. This is not an attack on Muslims. This is applying the Quran's own test. The Quran said Salah prevents these things. If it is not preventing them after 12 centuries and billions of practitioners, then one of 2 conclusions is unavoidable. Either the Quran's promise is false, or what is being practiced is not the Salat the Quran described. And since the Quran cannot be false, what is being practiced 5 times a day is not what the Quran meant. The Quran's own evidence convicts the ritual. But when you understand Salah as the establishment of God's system, a society built on justice, on honest dealing, on protecting the weak, on accountability before God, then the promise becomes self-evidently true. A society that genuinely establishes those values prevents indecency and wrongdoing structurally. Not because of the magical efficacy of body postures, but because you cannot simultaneously claim to be establishing God's order while cheating your employees, stealing from the public treasury, oppressing those with less power. The system itself prevents the corruption. That is what tanha means. It actively, structurally, systemically prevents. Not through ritual repetition, but through the actual content of what is established. Now let's deal with the objections, because honest engagement demands it. What about ruku' and sujood? These words appear near salat in certain verses and carry physical connotations in everyday Arabic. Does that not prove the physical ritual? Let's look at what the Quran actually says about sujood. In chapter 22, verse 18, أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَسْجُدُ لَهُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ وَالنُّجُومُ وَالْجِبَالُ وَالشَّجَرُ وَالدَّوَابُ. Do you not see that to Allah do sujood whoever is in the heavens and whoever is on earth, and the sun and the moon and the stars and the mountains and the trees and the moving creatures? The sun performs sujood. The mountains perform sujood. The stars perform sujood. Are you going to tell me the sun touches its forehead to the ground at prescribed intervals? Of course not. Sujood in its Quranic usage describes total orientation of a thing toward God, the complete submission of its nature to its creator. To insist it can only mean a physical posture when it appears near salah, while accepting it means cosmic orientation everywhere else, is to apply yet another double standard to the same book. And look at what the Quran says specifically about sujood when describing human beings. Chapter 17, verses 107 and 109. When those given knowledge hear the Quran, they fall on their adhkan, their chins, in sujood. Their chins, not their foreheads. In the standard prescribed prayer, the forehead touches the ground. But the Quran says chin. Traditional scholarship absorbs this quietly because it doesn't fit, hoping you won't notice. But you should notice. Because if sujood is a prescribed physical prostration where the forehead touches the ground, the Quran describing people falling on their chins is not a minor discrepancy. It is the Quran describing something entirely different from the ritual. What it is describing is a complete collapse of the self in overwhelming recognition. The response of a being broken open by truth, falling in total, uncontrolled yielding. That is sujood in the Quran, not a choreographed movement, total internal collapse into recognition of God. And ruku', the root does not mean a 90-degree bow. The root means to yield, to humble oneself, to lower in submission. When the Quran uses ruku', it is describing an internal posture of yielding, the bending of the will, not the geometry of the spine. Now, let's go to the verses that might seem to create the most difficulty, and let's be intellectually honest about them. Chapter 5, verse 6. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. When you rise towards salat, wash your faces and your hands to the elbows, wipe your heads and wash your feet to the ankles. This is the wudu verse, and it is the most physically specific verse in this discussion. You cannot wash your face metaphorically. So let's think about this carefully without trying to reverse engineer an answer which fits. The verse says when you rise towards salat. What does rising towards something serious, rising to an act of significant, conscious engagement, require? In virtually every human tradition and every serious human context, physical preparation marks the transition into a state of intentional engagement. You do not enter a courtroom disheveled. You do not enter a surgery theater without scrubbing. You do not approach a significant covenant in a careless physical state. The washing described here functions as a marker of intentional transition. I am now entering a mode of serious, conscious, deliberate engagement with God's guidance. It is a signal to your own self. Something meaningful is about to begin. This reading is actually more consistent with the Quran's emphasis on aql, reason, deliberate conscious thought, and tadabbur, deep reflection, than the ritual reading of your engagement with God is invalid if you did not wash in this sequence. Now the war verses and the context is everything, because the traditional reading tears them out of it. Go back to chapter 4, verse 75. وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تَقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ. What is the matter with you that you do not fight for the oppressed who cry out, Our Lord, take us out of this city of oppressors? That is the frame. The entire passage is about the duty of the believing community toward those who cannot free themselves. Keep that in mind as you read 4:102. With Salah, understood as duty, the scene transforms completely. Groups rotating to fulfill their obligation to the oppressed, executing a rescue under military threat, with continuous armed protection throughout. Not a prayer rotation, a liberation operation. And verse 103 immediately after draws the precise distinction. فَإِذَا قَضَيْتُمُ الصَّلَاةَ فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِكُمْ. When you have fulfilled the duty, remember God standing, sitting on your sides. If Salat were itself the act of remembering God, why does the verse immediately instruct continuous remembrance after it? Because they are distinct. Salah is the organized fulfillment of God's system. Dhikr is the unbroken personal consciousness of God that runs through every moment. One is institutional, the other is constant. The Quran separates them in the same breath. And apply the Quran's own principle. God permits prohibited food when life is in danger. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. God wants ease for you, not hardship. Killing one soul unjustly is like killing all of humanity. Pause. Let that land. A God who values human life above almost everything else would not ask you to kneel and prostrate on an active battlefield, making yourself a target. The traditional reading does not just fail linguistically, it fails by the Quran's own stated principles. What those verses actually describe is a community maintaining its duty to God and to the oppressed, even under existential threat, adapting the form without abandoning the substance. That is profound, far more serious than a prayer schedule. And then verse 103 continues, Inna salaha kanat ala al-mu'minin kitaban mawquta. Indeed, Salat is upon the believers kitaban mawqutan, a timed, prescribed obligation. The traditional reading uses this to mean 5 specific prayer times, but kitab means a written prescription, a defined system, a covenant. Mawqutan means timed, measured, bounded, a system that has its time, that is appropriate to its moment, that operates within the structure of time and history. This is the language of a civilizational obligation measured against history. The establishment of God's order is something that has its prescribed season, its appointed scope, its defined territory in time, not 5 alarm clocks in a day. Now here at the Quran Alone channel want to be honest with you, we would rather say we don't know rather than reverse engineer an answer. Because intellectual honesty is the only standard worth having. This verse is a genuine challenge. The time references are specific, and anyone who tells you they have a perfectly clean answer for that is either not being straight with you, or hasn't thought about it hard enough, or using extra Quranic sources to explain the book Allah said is fully detailed. Here is what we do know what the verse actually says when you read it without a predetermined conclusion. Now let's address chapter 17, verse 78. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر. Establish the duty from the decline of the sun to the darkness of night and the dawn. Notice what this verse actually says. It is not 5 specific time slots, it is 2 bookends. The descent of the day ending at darkness and the emergence of dawn. Together they frame the entire arc of human wakefulness. The verse is not a timetable. It is saying your duty to God spans your entire conscious existence, from the moment day begins to the moment it ends. Not a schedule of interruptions, a total claim on your life. Now look at chapter 107, Surah Al-Ma'un, one of the sharpest and most compressed chapters in the Quran. God describes those who kadhabu bid-deen, lie about, deny the reality of, the deen itself. What are the signs of this denial? Yadrul yatim, they thrust away the orphan. Wala yahuddu ala ta'amil miskin, they do not encourage the feeding of the poor. Then the devastating line, fawailun lil musallin, woe to those who do salat, woe to the musallin, the people performing salat are condemned. But why? Alladhina hum an salatihim sahun, those who are neglectful of their salat. Alladhina hum yura'un, those who perform it to be seen. Wayamna'un al-ma'run, and who withhold basic necessities from others. The Quran is not praising people for performing ritual salat. It is condemning those who perform the outwardly empty acts while completely failing in human responsibility. The entire chapter is a direct refutation of the idea that ritual performance is sufficient. The people are doing their salat. They are physically doing it. And the Quran says woe to them, because their salat is disconnected from justice, from care for the vulnerable, from the actual content of God's system. And notice what the Quran calls this disconnection, kadhabu bid-deen, lying about the deen, denying its reality. The ritual performer who neglects the orphan and withholds necessities is, according to the Quran, a liar about the deen. Because the deen is not the ritual. The ritual is the lie they use to cover their abandonment of the deen. Chapter 2, verse 177 makes the Quran's position unmistakably clear. لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Righteousness is not that you turn your faces toward the east or the west. The Quran opens its comprehensive definition of true righteousness by specifically and explicitly dismissing physical directional orientation as irrelevant. And what follows is a description of righteousness that is overwhelmingly relational, social, ethical, economic, believing in God and the last day, giving wealth despite loving it to relatives, orphans, those in need, travelers, those who ask, those in bondage. Then waqama as-salat wa ata az-zakah, and establishing salat and giving zakat, and fulfilling covenants, and being patient under suffering and hardship. Salat is embedded within a comprehensive ethical and social framework. It is not the centerpiece of a ritual hierarchy that everything else serves. It is one structural element of a complete system of human orientation toward God, expressed through concrete, observable, measurable action in the world. Notice the standard the Quran sets for itself. In chapter 4, verse 82, it says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not reflect on the Quran? If it were from other than God, they would have found in it much contradiction. The Quran claims internal consistency as its divine proof. So when a reading of the Quran creates contradiction, God performing ritual prayer, the Quran's own success metric failing empirically, preservation of life overridden by ritual posture on a battlefield, sujood involving the chin rather than the forehead. Those contradictions are not problems with the Quran. They are the Quran telling you that the reading is wrong. So then what is salah? The orientation of your entire being, your choices, your dealings, your use of power and wealth and time and speech, your duty toward God's guidance. The establishment of God's system in the world as a living, functioning, observable reality. The opposite of tawalla, turning away. It is what you do when you believe. It pairs with zakah, because together they describe a complete civilization. One pillar establishing God's guidance as the operating order, the other purifying the economic and social fabric. Together they build a society that actually, structurally, systemically, observably, prevents indecency and wrongdoing. Because the prevention is built into the system, not conjured by the ritual. The God of the Quran is al-Adl, the just, al-Hakam, the judge, al-Raqibu, the watchful. He does not describe himself as the counter of prostrations. The scales of the day of judgment weigh, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. Every atom of good and every atom of harm brought into the world. What you did with your wealth, your power, your words, your treatment of those who had less, your honesty or your fraud, your justice or your oppression. That is the accounting, and that is the accountability that a true understanding of Salah produces, because an abd servant who has genuinely established God's system cannot simultaneously be cheating, stealing, oppressing, while ticking the box of ritual performance. The system makes that contradiction impossible. The ritual makes it routine. Now we know what some of you are thinking. Even within the Quran alone community, there are those who still hold on to a ritual prayer. Some say 3 times, some 5, some even 8. And we say this with respect. That is nothing but Sunnism 2.0. Different number, same methodology. Taking something not clearly established in the Quran and building a pillar out of it. And honestly, we understand why. When you look around and see over 1 billion people doing something, when your family does it, when your entire community does it, when it's the one thing that makes you feel connected and belonging, it is genuinely hard to let go. That pull is human and real, and nothing to be ashamed of. But the Quran warns us explicitly about the blinding power of numbers, of tradition, and of social comfort over truth. In chapter 2, verse 170, Allah describes this exact human trap. And when it is said to them, follow what Allah has revealed, they say, rather, we will follow that upon which we found our forefathers. Even though their forefathers understood nothing, nor were they guided. The crowd is not your proof. The tradition is not your evidence. If you are using the behavior of the majority to measure the truth of God's book, you are missing the entire point of the message. In this short documentary, we have tried to explain what Salat could mean to the best of our abilities and understanding, and we might not be totally accurate in some instances, but what we can surely conclude is that Salat is anything but a physical ritual that needs to be performed a number of times daily. Like it or not, the Quran just does not support it. If this video challenged you to look at the Quran with fresh eyes, please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this perspective is important, helping this message reach others who are searching for these same answers. And if you want to join us as we continue to let the Quran speak for itself, subscribe and turn on notifications.